So I wanted to begin tonight, as is customary at York University, with a land acknowledgement. And here's York University's land acknowledgement. I do recognize that many of you are attending from various places around the world. I would ask you to, if the land acknowledgement that we're going to be looking at today is not applicable to you, I'd ask you to reflect on the norms that apply in your context in terms of the relationship between people, land, ongoing colonialism, and struggles against colonialism. So here's York University's land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Whenever we have events that are connected with migration and forced migration in Canada, I think it's particularly important for us to acknowledge that our conversations are going on in the context of ongoing colonization, of a settler in a settler state, that migration plays deeply contested roles in that. Migration has in the past been explicitly used as a tool of genocide in Canada, and so we want to be aware of that as we think about migration issues. At the same time, when we think about border control and forced migration, I think we should be considering questions about whose territory are we talking about? Questions about which communities get to make decisions about who comes to their territory and who is expulsed from their territory. I think the kinds of answers that different communities give to those questions are very different depending on how communities are situated. So the Canadian state might give one kind of answer. The Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation might give a very different answer. And I think it's important for us to think about those questions when we think about migration and forced migration issues. And I think in particular when we're having conversations about racism as we are tonight. Okay, so with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Debbie Douglas is the Executive Director of the Ontario Council for Agencies Serving Immigrants, and she's a member of the Immigration and Refugee Advisory Committee of Legal Aid Ontario, and the federal government's National Settlement and Integration Council. She's also been involved with the City of Toronto's Newcomer Leadership Table. She's been involved in the Toronto Community Housing Corporation Board of Directors. She's been the recipient of many awards, including Women of Distinction Award from the YWCA in Toronto, and several other awards. Today, Debbie will be speaking to us about race, migration, and belonging, and sharing her thoughts about racial inequality within the context of global migration. So Debbie, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments. So over to you.
Thank you, Sean, and good evening, everyone, especially to my friends who are online. Welcome. Sean, thank you for this warm welcome, and to the Canadian Center for Refugee Studies. Thank you for the invitation. As Sean was introducing me, I thought it's too bad you forgot to give a shout out to the Stephen Lewis Foundation, on whose board I sit, in this month of Pride. And they do tremendous work with gay and lesbian communities and around issues of HIV and AIDS in Africa. So I do want to acknowledge that work, and I'm very proud to be a member of the board of directors. Thank you especially, Sean, for the land acknowledgement. To that, I would like to add my respectful acknowledgement as a guest on these same stolen lands. Those of us not Indigenous to this land that settlers call Canada would not be here if not for settler colonialism, and in my case, the transatlantic slave trade. I work in a sector that is doing the hard work of reflection and understanding how we are complicit in ongoing settler colonialism. Even as autonomous, community-based nonprofits, we are part of the state-designed and controlled mechanisms of refugee resettlement and immigrant settlement, finding ourselves to be part of the ongoing settler colonial project of land theft or land dispossession, if you prefer, and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and cultures, including through high levels of Indigenous incarceration. Indigenous people are less than 5% of the total population, but make up about 32% of the federal prison population. And Indigenous women are 50% of the population in women's prisons. These figures are from the Federal Corrections Investigators' recent report. In the words of Pam Palmater, a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, activist, and politician from Mi'kmaqui in New Brunswick, the over-incarceration of Indigenous people, she says, is nothing short of genocide. There must be truth before there can be reconciliation. Dr. Palmater also said, the real goal of reconciliation is not met by a one-time political apology, the renaming of National Aboriginal Day to National Indigenous Peoples Day, or land acknowledgements before city council speeches and events. She said, everyone benefits from the historic and ongoing dispossession of land, wealth, and power of Indigenous peoples, whether they have lived here for 3 generations or arrived only yesterday. Everyone should contribute to making amends to Indigenous peoples. These are the learnings we grapple with in our sector as we reflect on our role in the settler colonial project and our responsibility to question, challenge, and disrupt it. Black people are overrepresented in the federal prison system and have been for decades. The Federal Corrections Investigator reported that Indigenous, Black, and other racialized inmates accounted for 60% of all uses of force in prison, while representing 44% of the federally incarcerated population. I want to share with you a reflection on anti-colonial struggles from Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter. This is an edited excerpt from the opening lines she wrote in her essay titled, and this is a very academic title, on settling the coloniality of being power, truth, and freedom towards the human after man is overrepresentation and argument. And this was published in the New Centennial Review in the fall of 2003. She says, all our present struggles with respect to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, struggles over the environment, global warming, severe climate change, the sharply unequal distribution of the earth resources, 20% of the world's peoples own 80% of his resources, consume 2/3 of his food, and are responsible for 75% of its ongoing pollution, with this leading to 2 billion of Earth's peoples living relatively affluent lives, while 4 billion still live on the edge of hunger and immiseration. To the dynamic of overconsumption on the part of the rich techno-industrial North, paralleled by that of overpopulation on the part of the dispossessed poor, still partly agrarian worlds of the South. These are all differing facets, she said, of the central ethnoclass man versus human struggle. Central to this struggle also is the usually excluded and invisibilized situation of the category, defined at the global level by refugee economic migrants stranded outside the gates of rich countries as the post-colonial variant of Fanon's category of les dames. These words still resonate in 2022. Frontex is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. In mid-April this year, Frontex posted a news release on their website with the heading, First Quarter, Illegal Border Crossings into EU Highest since 2016. Frontex wrote, and I quote, The first quarter of this year was the busiest in terms of illegal border crossings at the EU's external borders since the migratory crisis in 2016. Refugees fleeing Ukraine and entering the EU through border crossing points are not part of the figures of illegal entries detected. What Frontex referred to as the 2016 migratory crisis was a refugee crisis for most of us working in this field. 2016 was the year the EU and Turkey deal to control the entry and mobility of refugees and migrants. Migrant camps in Greece were turned into de facto detention centers. Those who failed to register for asylum or those whose request for asylum was denied were deported to Turkey. People were held there in the thousands. Doctors Without Borders suspended their activities in one of the camps because of unfair and inhumane conditions. Mid-2016 was also when the UNHCR said the total number of refugees and internally displaced people worldwide, a record 65.3 million, had reached its highest point ever, surpassing the previous record seen during World War II. More than half of all refugees were from Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. Most of Europe persisted in seeing the growing number of people seeking refuge as a migration crisis and came up with a barbarians at the gate response. Austria, Bulgaria, Greece, and Hungary built fences and walls. By 2017, Hungary's razor wire fence was a high-tech monstrosity of a wall with heat sensors, cameras, and loudspeakers that blasted sound in several different languages and was capable of delivering electric shocks. Legislative barriers were enacted to restrict entry, and so-called illegal border crossers were thrown in jail. Policy barriers were put in place to limit who got access to what. Practice barriers of fear, intimidation, threats, and differential treatment were meant to discourage those who were deemed to be unwanted or those who were the damned. There is a massive rise in xenophobia, racism, anti-Muslim hate, and white supremacy ideology. There was Brexit. This was all in response to approximately 1.25 million asylum seekers and migrants entering the EU in 2015 and 2016. As I said, most were from Syria, also Iraq and Afghanistan, but also from other countries. Yes, the numbers were unprecedented, and yes, the response from the European states was about prevention and containment. Fast forward to 2022, and almost 5.3 million Ukrainians has fled to the EU, a much higher number of refugees on the move compared to the 2016 refugee crisis. The response from the EU, Canada, the US, and almost all other global North countries was dramatically different from what we saw in 2016 and the Syrian and other from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In February 2022, this is how certain mainstream media journalists reported on these events. In a live report, a CBS foreign correspondent said, and I quote, "But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. You know, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose these words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that is going to happen." The two news hosts back in the studio in the US said nothing, just watched and listened, and I would guess silently agreed. An Al Jazeera English news anchor said, "What's compelling is looking at them, the way they are dressed. These are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from the Middle East or North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to." On the French BFM TV in France, a news anchor said, and this is a translation of the statement that was made in French, and I quote, "We are in the 21st century. We are in a European city, and we have a cruise missile fire as though we were in Iraq or Afghanistan. Can you imagine?" An ITV UK journalist said, "The unthinkable has happened. This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe." And on and on. These sentiments were repeated in Spanish, Italian, German, and other language media across Europe. Media outlets felt free to air xenophobic statements made in bystander interviews. A Spanish TV station aired this bystander comment in Spanish, and I translate. These aren't like the other children that we've become accustomed to see suffer on TV. These children are blonde with blue eyes. So this is very important. This us versus them narrative, the othering of Black people, of racialized people, of Muslims, was evident in Canada as well, reflected in the extent and depth of coverage of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, while humanitarian crises in Palestine, Afghanistan, Eritrea, and Yemen were ignored and rendered invisible. EU countries responded swiftly to the mounting humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Border crossings were expedited for Ukrainian citizens, while Black people were refused, leaving them stranded at the border for days in brutal conditions in the bitter cold. Many were young people from African countries who had traveled to Ukraine to study. Some were minors. Within Ukraine, en route to the border, African mothers with young children were pushed off trains. Africans around the world, including many from the UK, the US, and here in Canada, came together on social media platforms like live Twitter and YouTube to hear firsthand from Africans stranded at borders and inside Ukraine what they were experiencing and how we could help. The stories of the racial discrimination and abuse they endured as they fled to safety and even assault by border police were horrific. Those who were able to cross into Poland reported being confronted on the other side by organized white supremacist groups, sometimes in full sight of border guards and the police. Some Africans who found temporary shelter in hotels or apartments for which they had paid said they were turfed out to accommodate Ukrainian refugees. Airbnb host refused them shelter. No assistance was given to Afghan refugees currently in Ukraine or refugees from other countries. This was the first question I asked of IRCC when Canada announced that it was opening our doors to Ukraine. I said, this is an opportunity for Afghans in Ukraine to come to Canada. And the answer was no. This is for Ukrainian nationals only. In Canada, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship IRCC announced the Canadian-Ukrainian Authorization for Emergency Travel Program, a special program for Ukrainians. IRCC announced there won't be a limit on the number of Ukrainians who want to come to Canada temporarily. They can stay temporarily for 3 years and they can all get open work permits. Or for younger people wanting to continue their studies, international student visas. A special family reunification program was also announced for those wanting to stay permanently, but this program is yet to be rolled out. Canada's program for refugees from Afghanistan has a cap of 40,000. It has restrictions. It is primarily for extended family members of former interpreters, Afghans who assisted Canada's efforts in Afghanistan, and for vulnerable people who qualify for the humanitarian program. As of last month, approximately 10,000 Afghans were resettled. It is estimated it will take another 2 years to meet the Afghan refugee resettlement target of 40,000. Meanwhile, between March 17th of this year and the end of last month, almost 12 times that number of QF permits were approved for Ukrainians. Domestically, IRCC, in partnership with sector umbrella organizations like OCASI, established planning tables nationally and in provinces and regions across Canada to organize a welcome for displaced Ukrainian nationals. They pulled in representatives from provincial and municipal governments, from the immigrant and refugee serving sector across Canada, and from Ukrainian community organizations and groups. Other federal departments like Innovation, Science and Economic Development, ISED, and Service Canada, Employment and Social Development Canada, are also engaged. And aside here, and I do want to congratulate our sector partners who very clearly from the beginning said that they will not participate in the distribution of donations if it only went to Ukrainians. That all those who are in need, all refugees, all displaced people in their communities should be able to access all of the donations coming through. There has been a massive mobilization of sector resources to build an in-Canada response to the humanitarian crisis. The scope and scale has been quite astonishing, particularly in the way in which community organizations stepped up their efforts to collaborate and organize to get assistance out quickly and where it is most needed. We hope the model and practices that come out of this experience will serve as a blueprint for government community response in future crises. But there's also chaos and great frustration. IRCC didn't have a clear idea of what they wanted, how they wanted it done, and what was needed to do it. Our sector was emerging from the long pandemic and was facing the same challenges as everyone else, especially in staffing. We were all losing experienced and knowledgeable staff and struggling to fill vacant positions just to keep our ongoing programs operating. Dealing with the special measures for Ukrainians was an add-on. We simply didn't and still don't have the capacity to do everything we want or need. IRCC had promised to operate on the principle of additionality, both for numbers of Ukrainian nationals to be accepted by Canada and for the resources needed to support the settlement and resettlement efforts. But we continue to hear from organizations doing the work on the ground that their refugee and immigrant clients are facing more delays than ever for matters like work and study permit renewals and PR card renewals. In fact, virtually every refugee and immigration process seemed to have slowed down. By April of this year, IRCC's backlog was over 2 million applications across all categories. The promised settlement and resettlement service resources to support Ukrainian refugee resettlement have also been slow in rolling out, and community organizations, including those serving the Ukrainian communities, are struggling with the vast demand for support. A case in point is the income support promised by the Prime Minister in April, which was finally rolled out last week. This is a one-time payment of $3,000 for adults and $1,500 for younger arrivals 17 and under. And while we appreciate the attempt by the federal government to ensure that incoming Ukrainians have some sort of financial support, we know it isn't enough. Canada's response to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is welcome, it is good, and it is commendable. This is exactly how Canada should be responding to humanitarian crises anywhere in the world, concerning any people, regardless of how they look, regardless of their religion or faith, regardless of culture, regardless of their economic situation, and regardless of what Canada perceives their potential economic contributions to be. When asked about the disparity in Canada's treatment of Ukrainians compared to all other peoples in need of humanitarian aid, IRCC has consistently said it is because the situations are different. We are told the political climate, the economic situation, the geography, it's all different. But what we see is the unfairness and bias in Canada's response. Why is there a numbers cap for Afghanistan? Why does Canada not offer Afghanis the same travel permits and support offered to Ukrainians? Why do Afghans face restrictions on exactly who will be allowed in? As civil society members, let's not rationalize IRCC's choices because let's be clear, they are choices. Let's not rationalize that because of the challenges in exiting Afghanistan or exiting Pakistan, where very many Afghan refugees are, this is a reasonable choice. Let's not rationalize the political choices this government may have made either in global geopolitical relationships or locally with diaspora Ukrainian groups to respond in a profoundly different way to this latest humanitarian crisis. As civil society members, we can and must demand not just an equitable response of treating all groups equitably, but a comprehensive, inclusive response to all humanitarian crises. In addition to meeting a humanitarian need, provincial governments are not unaware of the demographic and labor market stakes. The government of Newfoundland and Labrador created a provincial desk in Poland to assist Ukrainian refugees. Newfoundland also has a high unemployment rate, as well as a high job vacancy rate, a shrinking population, and more older adults than young children. The Ontario government is helping Ukrainians find jobs in the province and has promised expedited processing and prioritizing of applications for Ukrainians who qualify for the provincial nominee program, which is a labor market selection program for permanent immigration. So much then for IRCC's assertion that the department's response is different because Ukrainians are coming as temporary residents expected to stay for 3 years or less and then to leave and go home. This is certainly not what the provincial governments are counting on, and I can tell you this is not what the Ukrainian Canadian community is expecting. Contrast these actions with the lukewarm response at the federal and provincial government level to civil society's demands to regularize the immigration status of thousands of workers already here and who have been working on the front lines of health, services, food production, and other critical sectors during the pandemic. In December 2020, IRCC announced the Guardian Angel program, meant as a pathway to permanent residence for current and refused refugee claimants working on the front lines in healthcare. The name Guardian Angel is illustrative of the bias in Canada's migration and humanitarian policies, which deem refugees as pure and deserving, while migrants are deemed as less deserving, if at all, and somewhat suspect for having economic aspirations. In a classic divide and conquer scheme, the program was meant to reward one group, refugees, and deny the other, migrants and undocumented workers, even if they were working side by side in the same roles, facing the same risks presented by COVID-19. As of May 2021, only 380 people were granted permanent resident status out of over 8,000 applicants. The program was so hemmed in with restrictions that the many refugee claimants who are daily risking their lives in the healthcare front lines did not qualify. We don't have data that can tell us exactly who was excluded, but I suspect that racialized people are overrepresented in those numbers, particularly racialized women. IRCC announced a different regularization program in April of 2021, but only for those with current temporary resident status. There was a cap of 90,000 applications and 2 streams, one for workers and one for international students. The university graduate stream was filled within a day, and the stream for non-healthcare essential workers soon after. But only a few thousand applications were received for the healthcare workers stream. When the program closed in November 2021, it was still short by several thousands. This was shocking, considering the number of temporary workers in healthcare who have been trying without success to get permanent residence, but not really surprising. The program had language requirements that could not be met by many healthcare workers. It barred refugee claimants, even if they were working in healthcare. And people without immigration status, those who we call undocumented people, were completely excluded. But a spokesperson for the immigration minister thought that these were bold initiatives representing a paradigm shift in our immigration system. The pandemic was a catastrophe for many precarious migrants as they lost work, lost housing, lost a temporary resident permit, and had refugee hearings delayed. During the pandemic, many risked their lives to keep Canadians fed, sheltered, and looked after, often in terrible working conditions. Whether as agricultural workers, in meat and fish processing plants, as caregivers for children, the elderly, and the sick, they are the lowest paid workers in virtually any sector, typically with no paid sick days or vacation. We hoped, perhaps naively, that their courage and sacrifice would galvanize the Canadian government into declaring some version of a broad-based regularization program, but it was not to be. In March 2020, Portugal created a temporary program to regularize all migrants with ongoing visa and asylum claims, giving them full access to health and social services. The program had its shortcomings, and many migrants were excluded. However, an estimated 223,000 people benefited. Migrant rights organizers in Portugal had hoped for more, particularly that Portugal would tackle root causes, but it didn't happen. But still, 223,000 people had their status regularized in Portugal, a country half the size of Canada. Here in Canada, IRCC followed a piecemeal approach to create pathways to permanent residence for a favored few. There was no effort to regularize undocumented migrants, let alone expand current programs to regularize people on temporary work and study permits. The immigration minister's new mandate letter from December 2021, and I know we often forget that we did have a federal election just last year. The new mandate letter called on the minister to do two things: to expand pathways to permanent residence for international students and temporary foreign workers through the express entry system, and to build on existing pilot programs to further explore ways of regularizing status for undocumented workers who are contributing to Canadian communities. It is not the regularization program we had hoped and advocated for over a decade, not even close. And while the last point of building on existing pilots, and we believe here that they're referencing the very small construction workers pilot that is being administered by the Canadian Labour Congress, it may provide an opportunity for those of us who are advocates to argue that that sentence in the minister's mandate letter signals the government's willingness for a broad-based regularization program. My sense, though, is that this directive will be narrowly interpreted by IRCC and the minister. The mandate letter didn't even include a remedy for the thousands of migrant caregivers who had lost their status and were now undocumented or were stuck in a backlog, or who were facing a precarious immigration future because they couldn't meet the language requirements attached to the permanent residency program for caregivers. This is the 55th year of the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program in Canada, the permanently temporary labor program that operates according to bilateral agreements between Canada and participating countries. Workers from the Caribbean and Mexico have been brought here for more than a half a century, indentured to one employer. They work in agriculture at minimum wage, compelled to live and work in conditions that most Canadians would not accept for themselves or their children. They spend most of the year in Canada, separated from their family, and then must leave for a few months only to return the next year, and the next year, and the next year. There is no prospect of permanent residence for these workers. Let's not forget international students, who not only pay very high tuition at Canadian institutions of higher learning, but also contribute their labor in highly exploitative low-wage work. In 2018-19, they accounted for almost all the growth in post-secondary enrollments. Canadian post-secondary institutions, including here at York University, benefit to the tune of nearly $7 billion each year in a direct transfer from international students. The students hand over that money while receiving little or no benefits or protection while in Canada, enduring exploitation and fraud from recruiters, and often working in the low-wage, precarious, and highly exploitative gig economy and underground labor market. And they do all this while facing immense pressure and high expectations to succeed in their education, as well as successfully gain permanent resident status in Canada. Recently, a group in Brampton, Ontario, sounded the alarm over the growing trend of suicides amongst young South Asian international students. Since 2000, Canada has quite deliberately grown the number of people in the country with precarious immigration status. Migrant rights activists estimate the number to be over 1.5 million, including refugee claimants, people on worker study permits, and people who are undocumented. A disproportionate number of precarious migrants are racialized. Canada's commodification of migrants is not new. In the 1880s, indentured workers were brought from China to build the most difficult part of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. They were paid less than white workers brought from Europe and denied the basic rights given to other workers and residents. Today, Canada brings in racialized people from the global South as temporary migrant workers to do the most difficult and lowest paid work, while denying them the basic rights given to other workers and residents. Very little has changed. Who gets in? Who gets full resident rights and entitlements? And who is excluded? We need to take a hard look at the impact of colonialism, racism, and patriarchy in the creation of people with precarious status and in setting up the structural disadvantages that will forever keep them in the margins. These structural disadvantages are reproduced in the refugee system as well. You are probably familiar with the frequently cited and shared passport index visualization by Youssef Al-Tamimi. a map of the world showing which nationalities need an entry visa for less than 100 countries and which ones need a visa for more than 100 countries. Let's call the latter the excluded nationalities. To no one's surprise, the excluded nationalities are almost all of the African continent, most of Asia, including the Middle East, just under half of the countries in the Caribbean, and a few countries in Central and South America, and 4 in Europe. Can you guess the 4 in Europe? Belarus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Kosovo. Afghanistan has the lowest rank, having access to just 36 countries without needing an entry visa. Equally relevant, the world's poorest countries have the least access to the richest countries. With the introduction of carrier sanctions, whereby airlines must check to make sure you have the right travel documents, visa requirements are enforced within these countries before the person even begins their journey. What are the implications for those seeking asylum in Canada, particularly those who have to contend with the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement? In July 2020, the federal court ruled that sending refugee claimants back to the USA under the Safe Third Country Agreement violates their right to liberty and security protected by Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The government now has plans on the way to close the so-called border loophole by declaring the entire border a port of entry and thus condemning future asylum seekers to the not-so-tender mercies of the US refugee system. Lest we forget, the narrative in the US since 2016 and on was about building walls at the southern border and the introduction of the practice of incarcerating children of families seeking asylum. Our Canadian government is also seeking to appeal the federal court decision in the Supreme Court. It is outrageous. The Safe Third Country Agreement is Canada's Eurocentric wall, meant to keep out those deemed to be undesirable, those deemed to be unwelcome. Refugee advocates on the front lines see the impact of structural disadvantage on racialized refugee claimants, but particularly those from African countries, the Caribbean and Asia, including the Middle East. They see the discrepancies in security screening for a refugee claimant from Latin America compared to a claimant from Turkey. The so-called credibility issues in family reunification applications for refugees from African countries compared to refugees from Europe or Latin America. The reluctance to believe racialized women fleeing domestic violence, especially Black women from the Caribbean and women from Africa. A report on IRCC's internal anti-racism employee focus group was produced in June 2021 and leaked a few months later to the media. The report confirmed the existence of systemic anti-Black racism that we have always suspected was present at IRCC. Nevertheless, the findings were explosive. The employees spoke of microaggressions and racist tropes at work, hiring discrimination and structural racism that prevented or reduced the hiring of racialized people in management positions, racial discrimination in promotion and retention. Excuse me while I wipe my hot flash sweat off my face. And what was of great interest to us? Racial biases in the application of IRCC's programs, policies, and client services that are believed to result from implicit biases among decision makers, as well as administrative practices that introduce biases or the potential for bias over time. IRCC employees shared the following specific examples of microaggressions they felt showed implicit bias that can affect the treatment of clients. Widespread internal references to certain African nations as the Dirty 30. Stereotyping Nigerians as particularly corrupt or untrustworthy. Such negative stereotypes were mentioned about certain other immigrant groups as well, but Nigerians were cited as the example particularly often in the conversations. A manager referring to Latin American applicants as people who just come here to collect social assistance. The employees also spoke about refusal rates by country as a possible indicator of bias. They said established practices have taken on discriminatory undertones for the sake of expediency or performance, such as discriminatory rules for processing immigration applications from some countries or regions that are different than others. Additional financial document requirements, for example, for applicants from Nigeria. concerned that increased automation of processing will embed racially discriminatory practice in a way that will be harder to see over time. And I'm hoping, Sean, that's one of the area of research that you'll be paying attention to, is the use of technology in decision-making. IRCC set up an internal task force to address some of these findings. Their focus was to create a safe and healthy workplace and address cultural bias among visa processing officers. What we wanted was systemic change. Naively, we also wanted a comprehensive, independent review of the immigration and refugee system to identify and subvert structural racism. Not going to happen, unfortunately. We wanted to look at who gets privileged and who is othered and excluded. Even as the special measures during the pandemic gave some people with precarious status an opening to become permanent residents, very few poor, racialized people and undocumented people were allowed in. We wanted a review of the class and race hierarchy reproduced through national occupational classification codes and immigration selection. Which jobs and sectors are deemed important and valuable versus others? While the pandemic revealed who was really essential and necessary to Canadian lives, these were not the jobs favored in immigration policy. During the pandemic, Canadians learned that the workers in agriculture and food production, the care economy and service industries were the ones who we needed to keep things going. But instead, immigration selection favors managers and PhDs. I know I'm surrounded by PhDs. In May this year, the Ugandan government passed a new law that criminalizes LGBTQI plus people and sex work. What will be the impact of Canada's exclusionary visa practices towards Ugandan asylum seekers and other Africans in need of protection against homophobia and transphobia? What is UNHCR's response to the many who have fled Uganda to the refugee camps in Kenya? The Association of Francophone Canadian Colleges and Universities reported that around 90% of African international student visas from French-speaking African countries are rejected. The refusal rate was 100% for students from some African countries. There's a similar pattern of rejection for applicants from English-speaking African countries, especially from Nigeria. Consider the impact of increased surveillance and the ongoing criminalization of what is deemed to be undesirable migrants. It is simply not enough to tweak the immigration and refugee system to dismantle barriers, to introduce the odd regularization program, or to find alternatives to immigration detention, or to train people out of acting on their racial biases. The system is doing exactly what it was built to do. It allows Canada to keep out those who are deemed undesirable migrants, those who might disrupt the dominant Eurocentric narrative of nation building. It commodifies migrants as wage slaves. Powerful interest groups within and without maneuver to maintain the supply of endangered labor from the global south. Our job then as advocates is to force the conversation, to demand action from our governments. I hope we are ready to talk about dismantling borders, about subverting the ongoing settler colonial immigration project, because that is what it takes to bring real change. I would like to conclude, and I always quote Audre Lorde to conclude. I would like to conclude with this well-loved teaching from Audre Lorde. She said, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." I'm speaking to my advocates and my activist brothers and sisters and folk out there. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. My fellow advocates, we need to find our own tools to dismantle the racist systems that we are faced with. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you.